You're listening to The Drag.
The Sunday drive was a popular ritual in the 1940s. Car ownership had been common for a few decades now, but it was still a luxury to get behind the wheel and take a long, leisurely drive through scenic country. Usually these drives took place in the afternoon, but one motorist in East Texas decided he'd take his Sunday drive early. And the roads around Texarkana, Texas were certainly scenic. The area is filled with winding dirt roads and tall pine trees that stretch toward the sky. It was March 24th, 1946. Spring had officially arrived just a few days earlier. The temperature floated somewhere around 60 degrees. A little bit of rain drizzled down. Just a month before, an unknown suspect had brutally beaten 25-year-old Jimmy Hollis. He was left for dead on a dark dirt road in a rural area north of Texarkana. The man also assaulted Jimmy's 19-year-old girlfriend, Mary Jean Larry, who was able to get away and call for help. After the attack, people mostly went back to their normal lives. It was as if that fearful winter night had simply melted away with the start of a new season. The motorist out for a Sunday drive that March morning probably didn't have these attacks on his mind. And he probably didn't think he'd discover evidence of another attack. Often, young lovers in the 1940s parked their cars on the dark dirt roads around Texarkana for some late-night privacy. But it was rare to see a car parked during daylight hours. So when the driver spotted an Oldsmobile parked along a dirt road around 9 a.m., he pulled over and went to check out the situation. The details of who the driver was and what he thought when he came upon the scene have been lost to history. But what he saw there hasn't. In the car, he found the bodies of two young people, bloodied and slumped over, both with gunshot wounds. The driver was the first one to discover what the rest of the town would soon find out: that Jimmy and Mary Jean's attack wasn't a one-off incident. The suspect had struck again, but this time, two people had been murdered. My name's Peyton Sims, and I'm the host of Season 2 of Devilish Deeds. In Episode 1, we talked about Jimmy and Mary Jean's date that ended with them both in the hospital after they were attacked by an unknown suspect. The attack left Texarkana citizens frightened and confused. But nothing would prepare them for the gruesome scene that they found on the morning of March 24th, 1946. In this episode, we'll talk about the Phantom Killer's first two murder victims and the strain it put on Texarkana law enforcement. "29-year-old Richard Griffin lived and worked on a farm in Cass County, Texas, about a 45-minute drive from Texarkana. Richard usually found himself in the Texarkana area on the weekends when he was able to escape from work. I talked to Andrea Luce, one of Richard's nieces. Richard died before she was born, but Andrea's mother told her stories about the family.
Well, I will tell you how my mother described him to me, or to us. My mother was the oldest, and all the other siblings, of course, were younger, and my mother was basically in charge of them while my grandmother worked in the fields. My grandfather was a baseball player that traveled a lot, was rarely home, so it was left to my grandmother to take care of the farm. And, of course, the kids, until my mother got old enough to work out in the fields with my grandmother, it was her responsibility to look after the kids.
But Richard wasn't necessarily the golden child.
All of them were good except Richard. Richard was, I don't know if I can say he was angry, or if it was just the sibling thing where you're not going to tell me what to do. You're not my mother. But it was, he was sometimes abusive to my mother, because he didn't want to do what she had asked him to do. And, so they had kind of a love-hate relationship. And I was also, my Uncle David also told me basically the same thing, that, Richard was kind of a rebel, didn't want to, listen to anybody.
To put it simply, he was a handful. He even had to live with relatives instead of his parents because of the conflicts he'd caused in his household. Despite her uncle's reputation, Andrea wanted to make one thing clear.
He was loved by all of them, I know that for sure.
He had auburn hair and freckles, and by all accounts, people found Richard charming despite the problems he'd cause at home. And according to Dr. James Presley's book about the Phantom Killer, Polly Ann Moore found him attractive. And Richard felt drawn to Polly Ann too. They started dating in February of 1946. Here's our expert on this case, Dr. Presley.
He was a returned veteran, CB, and she was working at the Red River Army Depot here.
You heard Dr. Presley refer to Richard as a CB. That's a nickname for someone who served on the construction force within the Navy. Polly Ann had bright blue eyes which stood out against her dark hair. And most people said she was pretty quiet. She was 17 and had recently graduated early from Atlanta High School in Cass County, which is about a 30-minute drive from Texarkana. She was also 12 years younger than Richard, but large age gaps like that weren't that unusual in the 1940s. On the night of March 23, 1946, Polly Ann got ready for a date. Dr. Presley told me that at the time, Polly Ann was renting a room in Texarkana so that she could easily catch the bus to her job at a local defense plant. Later that night, Richard picked up Polly Ann in his Oldsmobile. They'd been seeing each other for about 6 weeks. And on this particular night, the couple headed to the Canary Cottage, a restaurant that sat on the edge of Texarkana. It was open all night, so it was a popular date spot. Richard's sister and her boyfriend joined the couple for a double date. They chatted amongst themselves and ate, until it was time to pay their checks and part ways. Richard and Polly Ann's night was only just beginning. They had a midnight movie showing to catch. But Polly Ann had spilled something on her blouse at dinner, so they stopped by her home first so she could change before heading to the movie. This date might sound similar to you, exactly like Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry's date I told you about last episode. A double date, dinner, a movie. This was all pretty typical for young people in the 1940s. Richard and Polly Ann even went to the same movie theater Jimmy and Mary Jean did, the Paramount. They saw a movie called Snafu. It's a comedy in which a 14-year-old boy lies about his age and enlists in the army. Richard and Polly Ann laughed and shared popcorn. And despite their dinner and movie snacks, they stopped at a small cafe after the movie ended. Perhaps they were still hungry, or maybe Richard and Polly Ann were just young and in love, and they didn't want the night to end. Even after they left the cafe around 2 a.m., Richard wanted to draw out the night just a little bit longer. He drove outside of the city limits, looking for a dirt road to get some privacy with Polly Ann. The area was in a secluded marsh, about 50 yards off the highway. All they could see in their headlights were trees and bushes. The willow trees around them gave them plenty of privacy. They'd found the perfect spot to continue their evening. Richard killed the engine and turned off the headlights. They were left in the light of the almost full moon. But their privacy didn't last long. According to Dr. Presley's book, his theory is that a car pulled up shortly after they parked. Richard and Polly Ann likely assumed it was other lovebirds like them, looking for a place to park. But that was far from the truth. Richard and Polly Ann didn't live to tell the story of what happened after they saw the headlights moving towards them. We've pieced together a timeline with the help of Dr. Presley and his book, as well as some family members of Richard's. Here's what we've managed to put together regarding what happened that night. A man exited the vehicle that pulled up to Richard's Oldsmobile. He approached the driver's side of the car with a .32 caliber pistol in hand. Then, just like he did to Jimmy Hollis, he demanded Richard to take off his pants. Richard obeyed. The man likely shot Richard first, 2 times in the back of the head. He shot Polly Ann twice outside of the car, though it's not clear why she got out. Their killer put a blanket under Polly Ann. Her blood completely soaked through it onto the gravel dirt road. She might have tried to escape, or perhaps the killer even told her to run, toying with her psychologically like he did with Mary Jean. And before escaping, the killer must have put Polly Ann's body back in the car with Richard, because that's where the passerby found her the next day. Police arrived immediately after the passerby alerted them that Sunday morning. A puddle of blood spread outside of the vehicle. They found Richard's body face down between the seats, his pants around his ankles. Polly Ann's body slumped over in the passenger seat. Police noticed Richard's pockets were pulled inside out. They weren't sure if he tried to prove he didn't have any money, or if the killer had robbed him. Other than Richard's pants, both bodies were fully clothed, and police found no evidence of sexual assault. I talked to Ruth Mahoney about this night. Ruth is another one of Richard's nieces. Ruth's mom is the one who went on the double date the night of the murders. The man she was on the date with would eventually become her husband, and Ruth's dad. Ruth remembers her parents telling her this story. She says it stuck with her whole family for a while.
The night before he was murdered, he had dinner with my mom and dad in Texarkana, and he and Polly, and that was the last they saw of him. My mom married my dad less than, I think it was about 2 months after he was killed. And I always thought that was probably they married so quickly.
The police had even less evidence to work with than they did when Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry were attacked the month before. Jimmy and Mary Jean had seen their attacker and survived to share their stories. Something Richard and Polly Ann obviously couldn't do. And it had rained overnight, which washed away the evidence of any footprints or tire tracks that would have been left in the dirt. So law enforcement couldn't see where the killer might have gone after the murders. Richard had his ID on him, so police quickly identified him. But Polly Ann had nothing except for an Atlanta high school class ring on her finger, with the initials PAM. Atlanta was 1 county over, just southwest of Texarkana. So Texarkana law enforcement called city officials there who reached out to the school district. They had a name. Polly Ann Moore. As Texarkana law enforcement removed Richard and Polly Ann's bodies from the crime scene, officials in Atlanta made a difficult phone call to Polly Ann's mother. When Polly Ann's mom's phone rang that morning, she didn't know her daughter hadn't come home the night before. She didn't know that the worst had happened, that this phone call would tell her that her daughter would never come home. The county sheriff's office asked her to go to Texarkana to identify her daughter's body. she called Polly Ann's friend, Ardella, to let her know what happened. Then, a neighbor drove Polly Ann's mom and 14-year-old brother to Texarkana. Ardella rushed out the door, headed straight for the crime scene. The crime scene was a bloody mess. Richard and Polly Ann's blood had begun to seep out of the vehicle when investigators arrived, and the scene was about to get a lot more chaotic. In the 1940s, police didn't secure crime scenes the way they do today. Just anyone could walk up and see what was going on, which is exactly what happened at this crime scene. There were so many people walking around the muddy dirt road that the keys to the vehicle weren't found until much later. They'd been thrown away from the car and had been stepped on so many times that they were almost completely buried. A man at the scene, who was carrying a baby on his hip, bent over to pick up the keys with his bare hand. A person today would alert the police of their finding, who would then safely obtain the evidence with gloves, to later be tested for fingerprints. But even though law enforcement had basic fingerprint testing capability, they weren't careful with evidence at the scene. One of the most unbelievable pieces of mishandled evidence was Richard's car. Law enforcement took it to a police station on the Arkansas side of Texarkana, but to get it out of the crime scene, a group of people who had gathered there helped police officers push the car to a tow truck. These helping hands may have meant well, but their fingerprints in the car certainly wouldn't help the investigation. Here's Dr. James Presley.
Well, I wouldn't call it tampering with the evidence, but that's what it amounted to, because in the first case, the first murder case, people just conversed on it. Just the tracks, everything were just, it was hard to even reconstruct what had happened. And so it was not a good crime scene to investigate.
News of the double murder spread fast. Monday morning, the day after the two bodies were found, the headline of the Texarkana Gazette read, "Couple shot to death in auto." A portrait of Richard and one of Polly Ann stretched across the front page of the Gazette. Richard's portrait shows him in a suit and tie, smiling. In Polly Ann's, she poses by her front doorstep with her arm wrapped around her dog. The black and white photo is grainy, but you can still make out her grin. Officers found this photo in her purse at the crime scene. If she carried it around, it obviously had special meaning to her. We have some of the details about Polly Ann's last moments, but when it comes to getting to know who she was as a person, we actually know very little. Newspaper coverage in the 1940s often only focused on sensationalizing the crime, instead of sharing the details of the victim's life. I wish I could tell you what Polly Ann's favorite movie was, or even the name of her dog in that newspaper photo. But I just don't know that much about her. What I can tell you is that I feel a certain amount of kinship with her. Polly Ann grew up in my hometown of Texarkana. While she had already graduated from high school at 17, she was still just a teenager. When I was 17, I was a senior in high school. Growing up in Texarkana, my friends and I were desperate to entertain ourselves. We'd go to the movies, we would eat at Waffle House at 1 a.m, and we would drive around all night listening to music. After 10 p.m., the roads would be almost empty, except for us. Polly Ann and Richard were pretty much doing the same thing I was when I was 17. That's the age I was when I started dating my boyfriend. Our first date was even on a dirt road. We played 40s music on a Spotify playlist. We slow danced. We laughed. It was cold outside, so he let me borrow his jacket. We sat in the dirt and gazed up at the stars. After the outside temperatures became unbearable, we made our way into his truck, where we talked for hours. We didn't pull into my driveway until midnight. My soon-to-be boyfriend walked around to the passenger seat and opened the car door for me. When he walked me to my doorstep, I kept wondering if this would be the night I finally had my first kiss. But it wasn't. We were both way too nervous. I don't even think we held hands. And that's how Polly Ann's date should have gone. She should have been dropped off at home, where as she began to fall asleep, she'd recall little moments from her date with Richard. And there's so many little details from their night together, just like the things I remember from my first date, that I wish I knew. I'm 20 now. I left Texarkana and I moved to Austin for college. I'm still dating the guy I danced with on that dirt road. I've made new friends. I've made new memories. Something Polly Ann never got the chance to do. It's tough to think about, especially because all these years later, her murder still isn't solved. Police never found the killer or his motive. Most other crimes that had previously taken place in Texarkana had to do with theft, robbery, money laundering. There's usually a clear motive for these types of crimes. Richard's pockets had been emptied, but police determined he'd only been carrying a little bit of cash, maybe some coins. Certainly nothing to kill someone over. It just didn't make any sense. This was decades before the FBI would officially define serial murder, or officially coin the term serial killer. Law enforcement didn't know to look for patterns to identify a killer's behavior or identity. And in the wake of the second attack, it would be some time before investigators realized just what they were dealing with. Polly Ann's mother arrived at a Texarkana funeral home that Sunday. I would imagine that during the drive, her mind moved nonstop. Maybe the body wasn't Polly Ann. Maybe she ended up staying with friends, and this was all one big mix-up. Maybe someone else wore a class ring with the initials PAM. It probably felt like the longest drive of her life. When she arrived at the funeral home, she was led inside. She held her breath. She walked toward the lifeless body of a teenage girl. She stared down at the corpse, unable to move. The girl was undeniably her daughter, Polly Ann Moore. The doctor who examined Polly Ann's body after her murder said there weren't any signs she'd been sexually assaulted. But her body was transported to a funeral home in her hometown of Atlanta before she could have a formal autopsy. This is yet another error in this investigation. Police wouldn't be able to gather any additional information from her body. Since Richard had his driver's license on him when he was killed, his family was notified much sooner than Polly Ann's. They didn't have a telephone, but sometime that Sunday morning, a neighbor knocked on their door. The neighbor had heard on the radio that a young couple had been murdered, and he thought it might be Richard. Friends drove the Griffin family to the Arkansas police station to see if the Oldsmobile they had in custody was indeed Richard's car. And it was. According to Dr. Presley's book, after hearing the news, Richard's older brother hopped on a train from Dallas to Texarkana. He arrived in town shortly after midnight. He went straight to the funeral home where Richard's body was. He demanded that the funeral attendant let him see where Richard was shot. He was denied. The attendant said the police didn't want people to see the gunshot wounds. Richard's brother was angry. He yelled at the funeral home worker, saying that if the man didn't help him, he would go look himself. The man finally relented. He saw Richard's body laying face up. His face was still recognizable, but the funeral home attendant turned Richard's body over, and the brother saw them. 2 bullet wounds. The bullets were still lodged in Richard's head. Police wouldn't remove them until later. Both Richard and Polly Ann's funerals took place shortly after their murders. Richard's mother took his death especially hard, according to his niece Andrea. Since Richard and his mom used to always fight, it felt like they never had closure in their relationship. To make matters worse, the crime scene was located walking distance from where Richard's family lived. They were terrified knowing that something so awful could happen so close to home. Richard's niece Ruth told me how her family reacted to his death.
I think Uncle Richard's death was it put a real hole in the family. I often wonder if my mother and my Nana were afraid after he was killed, afraid that there was some connection with somebody that would come after them.
Dr. Presley says that despite the horrific murders, people hadn't yet connected these deaths with the attacks on Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry. Even the police didn't make the connection.
They were both from Cass County, the next county. And somehow that did not ring any bells to speak of. You know, people was concerned, but they didn't stop to think that nothing like this had happened before. It was in Lover's Lane, and they had like the other one, but they didn't connect the two. They had no connection with anything they could find. They checked out any people they'd known, and they didn't relate. No information.
By this point, local law enforcement had called for help from the Texas Rangers and the FBI. They examined the bullets removed from Richard's body. They didn't have bullets from Polly Ann. They'd been buried with her. A ballistics report would reveal that the weapon was a .32 automatic pistol, most likely a Colt. But that's all they had to go on. No other evidence. So they posted a reward, $500 to anyone who could provide information leading to an arrest and conviction. In today's money, that's more than $7,600. But none of the leads went anywhere. In the first 4 days after the murders, police took 50 people into custody for questioning. Still nothing. The police were stumped. And, as I was reporting on this story, I was stumped too. I can't stop thinking about the way this case was handled by law enforcement. The way everyone was allowed to gather around the car where Richard and Polly Ann's bodies sat as police investigated. The way one man picked up the car keys with his bare hands. The way several people put their bare hands on the car to push it to a tow truck. No gloves, no police tape, all that potential evidence, destroyed or washed away by the rain. So I decided to talk to an expert to help me understand why this investigation went so horribly wrong. He's actually someone I know pretty well. His name is Adam Head, and I first interviewed him for a story about the Phantom Killer for my high school newspaper. But he and I go back even further than that. He's the father of one of my close friends. I spent my high school years hanging out at his house, having bonfires or watching movies. He was a state trooper when I first met him, but now?
Basically, I'm an investigator for the Office of Inspector General in Texas. So it's the Texas Office of Inspector General. We work under the Texas Board of Criminal Justice. I worked 12 years as a state trooper for the Texas Department of Public Safety, and before that, I worked 9.5 years in local law enforcement.
So, he knows a lot about how law enforcement handles cases now. I asked him to compare what that would have been like in 1946.
The technology they had in 1946 was very limited, as far as a lot of things they based on as far as evidence goes, as far as like latent fingerprints, like the case of the Phantom Killer, they ruled out suspects a lot on the fingerprint analysis, latent fingerprint. Now they have digital fingerprint analysis where they can get it immediately and rule somebody out, whereas then they used the actual fingerprint cards and had a fingerprint analysis done on that, which a lot of times took a very long period of time. Other technology and everything obviously is DNA. Obviously DNA wasn't anything they could do with that back in 1946, whereas now they can have a DNA analysis conducted, just in a matter of days to rule a suspect in and out. So just a plethora of evidence now technology they can use now that they didn't have available back in 1946.
Victims couldn't be identified by DNA in 1946. That technology came 40 years later, in 1986. Even if there had been DNA on Richard's car keys or the car itself, they wouldn't have been able to do much with it. And the police didn't have a murder weapon. Just the ballistics report that pointed to that .32 caliber Colt pistol. They needed more information. Without it, chances of finding a suspect were pretty slim.
Well, with the technology we have now, as far as the crime scene technology and the way it was handled in 1946, a lot of things they did then as far as communicating, they didn't have the emails and stuff of that nature. They had, they acted a lot on sending letters, and as far as the media attention and everything, it would play a tremendous different role. They had where they were having people sent in, staying at hotels here, as far as journalists and stuff in that nature, and it would have been handled different.
Weeks passed, and police got nowhere. Less than a month after Richard and Polly Ann died, another young couple went for a drive. They drove to an isolated dirt road in Texarkana Spring Lake Park, and neither of them were thinking about who might be lurking in the shadows.
Had this happened today, it would have been a slam dunk. Somebody would have been arrested and convicted for what happened. And this was a serial thing. It wasn't just Richard and Polly.
Next on Season 2 of Devilish Deeds.
And this was the thing that set the town in stitches of fear.
It had been played up in the papers, and there was a lot of fear in the community. The whole community was in shock as a result of those series of killings.
So that school year had already been very traumatic for them. They were very young, and that was, the beginning of their high school career, and it traumatized them a great deal. But then during the investigative process, the Texas Rangers kept bringing them in. They would come to the school and get students and take them downtown and interview them for hours. And they were doing this day after day after day.
This season of Devilish Deeds was reported, produced, and hosted by me, Peyton Sims. The executive producer is Katie Pink-Shigautka. Katie also did the editing and sound design for this podcast, with editing assistance from Sewa Oliveras. The associate producers are Jade Emerson, Aurora Berry, and Liv Gamble. I'd also like to thank Dr. James Presley for allowing me to reference his best-selling book, The Phantom Killer, throughout this podcast. Because of his diligent research, all 5 episodes of this season were possible. I'd like to say a special thanks to my boyfriend Assad Malik, who you heard me mention in a couple episodes. He not only read over some of the first drafts of my scripts, but he also helped produce a promotional video. The Drag's marketing and communications manager is Sofia Vargas Curam. Alexa Georgelos designed the cover art, and I took the photo. The Drag is an audio production house within Texas Student Media at the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin. Special thanks to Robert Quigley, Rachel Davis Mercy, and Gerald Johnson. The Drag is a non-profit educational program that gives students like me hands-on audio storytelling experience. If you want to support our work and help us create podcasts like this one, visit thedragaudio.com/donate.